time. Very quick introductions to all of us. Obviously, Mark's giving you an intro. My background's 20 plus years in recruitment and the last 10 in having my own consultancy, running bespoke projects for clients, which are all research and data led. So hopefully I'll be able to give you some really good insights. Carla, Lisa, do you want to add a few comments around there as we go to the next slide?
Yeah, so for us, this is something that we use on a daily basis, is always trying to guide the business, trying to use data-led decisions. So for us, it's something that was really topical at the moment, very relevant.
Fabulous. Again, Lisa?
No, I would echo that obviously, you know, making decisions, data-led decisions, and to drive sort of attraction plans, strategy, etc., was obviously a big part of it, and more sort of emphasis on data and the quality of data that we get. Yeah, so this is obviously, it's really important and really informative today.
And I've always had the pleasure of working with you both separately, so I know how well you utilise data along the way as well. Now, if we go into the next slide, just a very quick intro into why data is important. I'm not going to talk you through most of these slides. They're there as a reference point, so we'll try and keep this really conversational today. But I'm definitely a self-confessed geek. I do love data. I love research, which is obviously why I'm in the right job doing this. And what I did want to share with you, just some of my observations of what I'm finding with clients. So a lot of the organisations that I'm partnering with actually have a lot of data, but as a general trend, they're not really utilising data effectively or properly. They often don't realise the amount of data they actually have to hand. And the second big theme that I'm noticing is that, you know, the market has changed. It's extra activity to get candidates through the door. We're having to work really hard to prove our worth and to do things at speed and on tight budget. And as a result, a lot of my clients are actually skipping the data insight-led let's pause at the beginning phase and are having a lot of challenges in their projects later on and having to rebudget or rethink the way that they're doing things. So a couple of my observations on there. Now, before I go into asking Carla and Lisa a little bit about some of the projects that they worked on, I would definitely love to know as to how many of you actually feel that you have sufficient access to data. And by that, I mean quality data in your organisations. Because I've certainly found that there's a real mix, and sometimes people don't genuinely realise what data they have, or often the data that they're finding isn't really quality data. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, Carla, what you found internally.
So for us, it's more of a challenge to get the quality data. I think trying to get non-mandatory information up front is always a challenge. And then you have you can then back that up once the individual is in the organisation by doing surveys, but obviously often people don't engage. So I think it is something that we're always trying to incentivise, but we do struggle with it.
How about you, Lisa? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've got data. It's the quality of data again that we are looking for, and data that's meaningful. So, you know, utilising the right data for what the goals are. So, like I said, we've got access to a lot of it, but it's the meaningful data that is probably more challenging.
Yeah, I suppose one of my other observations has been a lot of reliance on AI. So clearly, for us, one of the things we do is we deep dive and we qualify data, and it's real-time data through conversations and various verifications. But that's been really interesting, where people have tried to shortcut actually getting the data, but not really getting a true picture. So what they're getting is a starting point for a conversation, but not necessarily a true reflection of what's actually going on in the market. So as we move on to the next slide, I would love to know them from the two of you around some of the projects that you've been working on, and yeah, just give us a little bit of an insight as to where you've been leaning on data and what changes you've been driving internally.
Yeah, I suppose, like we talked about in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, there's definitely a bigger shift within the organisation for data. The requests, you know, coming in fast and thick. We looked at our sort of recruitment goals. We made sure we defined the recruitment goals, which were pretty sort of standard, straightforward in terms of we've got high vacancy numbers, we had high turnover, high agency spend, and probably not the best candidate experience. So obviously the goal, you know, that we defined is to improve those. So improve those basic sort of stats, really. Data's been integral in that. So basically an overhaul of that recruitment process, really looking at it quite granularly so that we could really identify where the pinch points were, where there were gaps, where there were, hold-ups, bottlenecks in that process. So yeah, in terms of data, we've spent a lot of time sort of collating that data so that we could identify where improvements could be made. Like I say, it was quite, it's a lengthy process. We've got quite a simple recruitment process, but to make it more granular so that we could identify those sort of pinch points. So that's where we sort of started, I suppose, with the data. And then we could track, obviously, the results from that.
What about for you, Carla? What have been some really big strategic projects that you've been working on?
Yes, over the past 12 months, we've launched our sponsorship project, which I think there was a lot of kind of tension around whether or not we should move forward with this, because as you can see, every day the government are kind of changing the legislation in terms of how and why you sponsor individuals. So we launched a UK sponsorship programme, which meant that we was only sponsoring people who was already here within the UK. And I think despite an initial kind of bit, a few reservations around getting involved, quite quickly some of our really hard to recruit to locations, we started to see some really quick wins with them. So it then created this knock-on effect where every service across the whole of Kisimul wanted to be involved. However, for those of you that have offered sponsorship to candidates, you'll know that you can't just offer them any service. There's a lot of kind of data that you need to submit as part of that application, and that will be evidencing that your roles are hard to recruit, your cost per hire, the source effectiveness, the time to fill, and a lot of roles within healthcare, especially, we call them evergreen roles because we are always recruiting. So that actually then made it quite difficult to be able to articulate how long a role had been open. So there was a lot of kind of manipulation of that data that we needed to do to be able to get out what we needed to evidence the business case, and it's actually been really, really successful. So we're still we're still on year 2 of that journey now, but it has given us some really big successes.
That's really amazing to hear. I suppose what strikes me sometimes, and some of the biggest challenges that have come back from the questions before we did this webinar, was actually around how you create messages that are very insight-led, that are powerful, that will land with stakeholders. So both of you have clearly done some really big scale changes, which will have been welcomed by some people and not by others. So I'm really interested to understand, in your experience, how have you gone through creating powerful messages? Like, what have been your processes? What things have worked for you well?
For me, I think it's keeping people updated along the way and talking in a language that they understand. So quite often in the world of recruitment, we'll talk about statistics that the operational staff might not necessarily understand. So I think it's, as Lisa mentioned earlier, trying to find that link to our strategic goals. So if we know, for example, operations are really heavily managed around their agency usage. So for me, to make this a success and to get the buy-in from the operational teams, we needed to link this back to where is the saving for you? How is this going to benefit you directly? And I think, when you break it down into some really smaller targets and goals that everybody can relate to, you can much easily get the buy-in.
What about yourself, Lisa?
Yeah, I would agree with that in terms of sort of the messaging and insight-led messaging. Like I said, just going back to that example of really breaking down our process to make it really granular, it meant that we could provide that data, provide that report, quite descriptive, but also within that we were utilising visuals, which obviously worked, so we could see the comparisons, the befores, the afters, and presenting that data. Like I say, in detail, really help with that messaging in terms of where we needed to improve and the improvements that we have made and the successes that we've had from that. So again, I think understanding what the priorities are, understanding your audience as well and what they're looking for was, that was sort of fundamental in how we presented that back.
Yeah, because one of your big projects I remember you mentioning was your onboarding process, where you literally had to break down every step of your ATS system and the process.
It was, like I say, with going through a lot of the process, we could really identify where our pinch points were. So, for example, It could be that we would identify that there was delays in hiring manager, their accountability as part of the process. So we could see where there were delays with that. We could see where there were delays with the offer paperwork coming through, offer process. So this was leading to disengaged candidates, the candidate experience, the onboarding process. We could see the pinch points there where people were in onboarding for a long time, where the app wasn't working with different platforms. So it really made us channel where where our focus was and the improvements that we could make by utilising a different platform, bringing that in, speeding up that process. Yeah, there was a lot of work involved in that, but it was all, like I say, data driven. We could see where the dropout rates were, all the hard work that was being done, and then people coming into onboarding and being stuck in onboarding too long. So yeah, that was obviously a big thing, and some good results from that. But that was identifying that a different platform was going to support with that, the automation was going to support with that, and training and support for onboarders and hiring managers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've got some examples as well on the next slide, but I think from my experience, the most important thing as an external partner has always been about making sure that I get everybody in the room, all the stakeholders, try and understand if there's any silent stakeholders, and genuinely really go through in detail, what is it that they're looking for? What are their objectives? What are their limitations? So that I can have a really clear idea of what is it that they actually want to have represented back to them, what data is going to matter to them, so that when we are, constructing and putting together our reports or messages or linking things back in, I can talk to each stakeholder and may be able to answer to them, yeah, do you know what, we can make you this cost saving, or these will be your challenges, or these are your options, and then they're quite well linked in to all those things. So on these slides, there's just literally just some examples of some of the things that I generally find have mattered to organisations. And I suppose in those early conversations, being able to really outline what are the metrics and getting some real collaboration from stakeholders of what they want to see when they want to see it, means that you've got a really strong platform for understanding what messages decision makers really want to hear. Is there anything else, Carla? I feel like you might have had a thought
No,
there.
I think it's interesting, isn't it, when you hear other people talk about the same problems. And Lisa, you mentioned there about the onboarding, and I think one of my biggest frustrations working within this sector is when managers will make reference to onboarding delays, and actually the paperwork is still sat with the hiring manager, it's not even in onboarding. So I think being able to break it down into the initial parts of the process is really, really useful.
Yeah, I think it helps, doesn't it? It's the storytelling that we talk about with data. That you get the pushback, and you can explain it better when you've actually got the data and the stats to deliver and to show that message. So yeah,
I think one of the things along the way is crafting powerful messages and being able to build trust is about a lot of the other internal work that you're doing in the background, and some of the softer conversations that you're doing to actually understand why something matters, how somebody likes to communicate, their time pressures. So actually your messages are sometimes almost about a little bit of the trust and the relationships that you've built and the credibility that you've shown along the way as well. And I know with some organisations that I've worked with for 10+ years, they know that I understand what they need. I've understood how they want to have things communicated, and we're able to have some really, just some really clear communication strategies that they can then pass on to other stakeholders. So, and again, when I'm thinking about, going on to how we communicate things back, for me, if you lead with clarity and use the data and the insights, I feel that always works. You take the emotion out of it. And I never try and use jargon with organisations or with decision makers. I tend to find that they really, really switch off. So when we're presenting back data, it is literally, I've got, it's taken us 10 conversations to get to one candidate. It took me 60 approaches to get to that person. That means the market is passive. I will give them examples of what that means, what the competitors have said, why something's been discounted, so that they get a really full picture, some really clear understanding of the whole market, because often they're not in the market, they're not speaking to people, they're not really understanding what competitors are doing at that level in detail. And yeah, we listen, we try and understand from them what they feel about the data and the market, what their perceptions might have been, so that we can invite then ideas of how they would like to solve that alongside some of our solutions. But again, I'd love to hear from the two of you around what sort of strategies have worked for you when you're communicating with people, what sort of data that you've presented back, and at what milestones when you're going through some of these changes.
Yeah, I think obviously with different examples, I know that we've partnered with you quite closely, Réka, on some of our difficult, hard to fill roles, clinical roles, things like that, which have been quite a challenge. And so being able to get the data that we could see, that we've got, sort of the internal data, etc., but the benchmarking externally as well really supported some of those conversations that we could have and the business case that we could put forward to say, a lot of it came down to not being competitive in the market, and we could see that. So whereas just saying to a hiring manager, we haven't got anybody, we haven't got that, having that data and bringing them into those conversations early on. So we did a lot of the market mapping before going out to market, so that we knew what the business case was, we knew what we needed to do to be attractive. So I think bringing those stakeholders, your hiring managers, etc., bringing them into the conversation, collaborating with them earlier on, really proved to be more effective than some of our previous campaigns where we were almost on the back foot. So I think that's been really, really helpful. And like I say, just getting that external benchmarking as well brings sort of that data to life.
One of the other things that you mentioned, Lisa, actually, in one of our conversations, that you actually worked internally on a dashboard, which has been really useful for you around actually having real-time data. Would you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, very much obviously presenting data-driven. You've got your monthly reports, your monthly meetings, etc. But a lot of the time, that data, by the time you're presenting that data, some of it is now, it's older, it's out of date, it's not live. And again, it's a different audience. So some of that would be with your hiring managers, some of that was going to sort of senior level and what they wanted to see. Creating the dashboard that was almost a bit more real time. So, collating the data from obviously the ATS, the spreadsheets that we use as resourcing partners, etc., meant that managers, hiring managers, anybody involved in the process, our business partners, etc., could actually see where things were up to. So it gave more real-time data. And I think that just brought it to life because it was easier. There was, it's a chart, it's a diagram, it's a visual. It just made that easier than waiting for a narrative and waiting for a report. So that proved effective, combined with obviously other channels and other methods of communicating that.
What about yourself, Carl? Because obviously you're doing a lot of reporting and you're doing a lot of stakeholder engagement also at board level. So what have you found in terms of your communication strategies to get their engagement?
So for me, it's been taking them on the journey with us and breaking it down into specific, really measurable goals that we can update the business on what we've been doing. I think our messaging, we've tried to really explore the use of, in particular, things like LinkedIn, our internal comms platform, so that we can talk about a lot more than, come look, we're advertising, these are our roles. So to try and bring people on that journey to show all of the good stuff that goes on in the background and get managers involved. We've been trying to talk about the importance of our EVP. And, if you say that to ops, quite often they have no recollection of what you're talking about. So I think it's trying to get them to buy into those storytelling that we're trying to do, and getting them to share back their experiences so that we can use them as part of our attraction, like for example on LinkedIn. I think just getting the buy-in from them really and keeping them engaged in the journey.
And what have you found when you've had gaps in data? Because obviously for us, we're often that external partner that's filling the gap, but how else have you utilised different ways of finding gaps of data that you might not have through your system, or where you feel actually maybe it's not it's not quality data, or you're just not feeling that comfortable in relying on it?
So for us, Excel, the data that we had, I mean, for example, we know we struggle to recruit registered managers. And I think our organisation quite often thinks that we're just not looking in the right places. So what we've started to go back with is a bit of a talent map of the market. These is everybody, you know, let's look at a location. These are all the registered managers that we know are in a 50-mile radius. This is where they're working for. This is their current role. These are the people that have spoke to us. This is their current salary. These are their reasons that they're not currently interested. And I think rather than going back and saying, look, nobody's interested in this role, you know, we need to up the salary by $5,000. We've got some really good evidence there that we can showcase to our senior leadership team and say, look, this is the market, this is the struggle, this is the feedback that we're getting from our agencies, these are what our job boards are telling us, you know, this is the market that we're in at the minute. And I think for us that then brings them on that journey and we get that respect rather than thinking that we're just not being successful.
Definitely. No, I can definitely find that. I'm going to put another question to the audience and hopefully you'll give us some honest answers here about what you're finding when you're influencing stakeholders. Are you finding that you're dealing with outdated and unrealistic expectations? Or if anybody tells me that not really, I'm going to come and join your organisation, to be fair. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because again, my observation over the last 2.5 years with the market changing and dealing with a lot of stakeholders is that expectations have become outdated as people retire or as organisations look to restructure and be leaner. There's an expectation that certain skills exist. There's an expectation that you know, when you're looking to hire a certain profile, the budget is X, Y, and Z as it was 5 years ago, and that is not the case. So we're really having to go back and influence and handle a lot of, just a lot of outdated expectations. On the next slide as well, I did put some notes on some of the other reasons why we found obstacles come up as well. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to finding out how you're finding this. Great. I'm going to join that 4%, whoever they are. I'm going to find your organisations, that's for sure. So thanks for your input on that. What about yourselves, Carla and Lisa? Who have been your big, the stakeholders have disengaged along the process, or the stakeholders that have given you the most amount of obstacles, and how have you, come to overcome those challenges?
I think it's aligning with their priorities again, isn't it? I think it's opening the conversation and looking at understanding why. And I think why is the important question to all this, you know, with data. Why do we need that data? What are we trying to say? It's not just the what, it's the why behind it. And I think understanding why they are disengaged in the first instance, sometimes their priorities have changed. You're still on that one path where you're providing reporting or, you know, whatever your goal is, you're still working on that. And meanwhile, their priorities actually changed. So I think, again, it's that communication. It's understanding why they're disengaged. Have the priorities changed? Are they not seeing a return on what they expected? The results are not speaking for themselves, kind of thing. So I think it's understanding that and realigning, and then obviously making sure what you're giving them, and data that you're providing them with, actually aligns with their priorities. I think, having those conversations, those regular meetings, getting the feedback. I think at the end of the day, feedback loops are always important in this, because that's the way you can improve and negotiate what you're going with.
What about yourself, Carla?
I'm just thinking more recently, we are struggling with getting stakeholders to understand the link back to how it affects their world. So for me, it's trying to articulate the cost and the rationale behind it and the wider impact. So, for example, we've had some cultural issues in a couple of locations. And I'm trying to get the business to really engage with us and how we can improve our brand in those pockets. And I think it's, that's something that they see as a nice to have, and not necessarily, for example, if somebody goes and applies on LinkedIn and a couple of days after they've applied, they get a review to say, look, 10 people have left reviews for this organisation in the past week, and here's what they've said. they're not aware of that information that's out there. They're not aware of the impact on your brand. So I think for us, trying to be able to articulate the impact that has, well, actually those people then drop out of process, or those people are non-starters, or those people disengage with us, and being able to articulate the cost associated with that then gets them interested. But I think a lot of it they think is quite fluffy. So it's storytelling again, isn't it? How do we evidence the value behind some of this activity?
Yeah, we could go to the next slide. I suppose I'm picking up on some of the comments in the chat as well about recruitment is easy and anyone can do it. Yeah, definitely come up against those as well when we're putting proposals together. I think with some of those things, what we've tried to do is go back to what you said, storytelling, Carla, but actually help them understand how the market's changed and maybe give them data on what it was like 2 years ago, so they've got a little bit of a comparison. But I also think we've got to have real confidence in what we're presenting to be able to say, just giving me an extra 5-10 grand isn't going to get you this candidate or complete your project, because that doesn't exist. The market is telling me X, Y, Z. In order to fill your vacancy, these are our options, and giving them the opportunity to collaborate. And same with change projects. When we've supported organisations with restructuring, taking out layers of roles, and them expecting that they'll be able to hire a certain skill set, a certain salary bracket, and actually our talent profiling in regions have said, actually, that's not the case. It's being able to go back and say, this is the 20-30% you need to compromise on. Will this fit your strategy? And allow them to make those internal decisions. Anything else, Lisa, as we've been talking, that's come up for you?
No, I think it's like you say with the data. I think it's always the data supports, doesn't it? It supports the conversations. And a lot of that is about the conversations and the communication. I think, like you say, somebody commenting there about recruitment, anyone can do it. It's the complexities behind it, and it's being abreast of the change, and being able to discuss that with your managers, with your hiring managers, with your stakeholders, to get them on board with that process. So I think for me, it's always been that more so in the sort of last 12 to 18 months, the data's there. It supports the conversations that we're having. And
early on, like you said,
that narrative, doesn't it? So
yeah, and I suppose, like you said, one of the things you're very good at with your team is you were always looking at the data at the front end, so that you're able to manage expectations. And sometimes you do go through a process and you have to prove the data in that process, and it can be costly. But I think if you do that once or twice, you gain the credibility, and then you're able to influence stakeholders a lot earlier on. I suppose the other thing that for us as an external partner, we have proposals when we outline things. So when obstacles come up, I have a clear set of objectives and goals and things that we've agreed on, and it is a contract. So there's no reason why internal teams also can't sometimes utilise those things where you've outlined, this is what we're looking to do, these are the reasons why, these might be the challenges, and it allows you to hold people a lot more accountable along the way.
And that's it, yeah, accountability as well, because it's quite easy to, without getting into that, but past the book, that there's a problem with recruitment, or there's a problem with this, we can't attract people. And like you say, once you unpick and once you can show the data and show where, like I said, those pinch points were, or where the gaps were, that then changes the narrative. And it shifts the accountability, really. We try to work quite collaboratively with that, so that, like we say, we bring people on that journey with us. It's easy to sort of be, I suppose, with that blame game basically, but with having sort of data and reporting and being able to identify where that is, it does change that narrative. And then you do, I think, the buy-in does come. There's a trust in the data that you've got, and a trust in your messaging and what you're actually delivering.
Absolutely. And I guess as we go into our sort of final closing point around measuring success, as you've gone through these projects, what have been the key metrics that you've been using? Like, how have you shown the value of the project?
Yeah, I mean, one of ours, obviously, like I said, initially was defining the goals, was, reducing the vacancy numbers. That's, pretty, that was clear. That was quite an easy sort of a figure to show. What we did dive into beyond that was the quality of those hires as well, though, and that became another sort of project in terms of looking at the retention. So looking at the retention data became important. The improvements on time to hire, again, that was an important metric, along with the reduction in the agency spend. So by, like I say, identifying the gaps in the process, we could speed up the process, we could fill those gaps, we could fill the vacancies in a more timely fashion, which therefore then reduce the agency spend. Like I said, we didn't start looking then at the quality feed to make sure that we had, that was improving the retention figures as well. That was contributing to that. So it was all parts to that sort of, I suppose, that puzzle really that was, starting to slot into place.
There's on the next slide, there's also some ideas around measuring organisational change and some of the metrics. I wonder, Carla, with some of the bigger concepts that you've been working with, some of the changes, what's worked well for you, and what sort of measures have you had in place?
I think one of our biggest measures of success is our referral programme. So when I initially joined the organisation, we had a referral programme that was really, everybody was disengaged. They thought it was rubbish. Nobody got paid on time. Nobody wanted to engage with it. So for me, there's no bigger measure of success than having a happy workforce that wants their friends or previous employees to come and work with us, because I think that shows that they're really happy to recommend, their place of work. So for us, this is as attributed to about 25% of our offers over the past 12 months. And I think that speaks volumes about the experience that we're having. We implemented a 1-week check-in call to see how people was getting on. And that also gave us a lot of data and insight that we wouldn't have else captured up until that person then had decided they wanted to leave the organisation. So again, we was able to get on the front foot with some of that feedback and share it with the hiring manager or with HR, dependent on where it was relevant, to try and, fix some of those perhaps teething problems that there was having in the early days. So for us, that's been 2 kind of measures that I think sit outside of your standard, but have worked really well in trying to articulate how happy or not they are.
I suppose for me, the one sort of big point about measures is just making sure that you're actually tracking things that are meaningful. I know it can be easy to track certain parts of the process, a certain bits of data, but essentially if it's not really answering what the stakeholders are looking to, the questions, what's on their mind, what the things that they want to be reported on, the measures are kind of irrelevant. So you've probably got way more experience than me in terms of setting up your ATS systems and your reports to make sure that works. And have you found over the years that you've been able to change the way that you measure things and adapt to the changing needs of the organisation?
I think we've got no option at the moment. I think just legislation alone means that you've got to be on the front foot of making sure that you're capturing the right information. You're going to find yourself in a bit of a mess, and it's easier to be on the front foot than it is to try and unpick it later down the line. So for us, we're always trying to do a little bit more than we have to get ahead of the curve, especially without, D&I data. That's something that, again, you struggle because it's not always mandated at the beginning part of the process, and then you've got to play catch up further down the line. So for us, it's something that we're always trying to develop.
Before I go to the close, there's just one quick question from Marietta, which is interesting about hiring managers, even when you provide data and insight, not really being able to empathise with the struggles and how we might handle that. I suppose if I've come across that, a lot of the time it's actually trying to really unpick what is the obstacle, really understanding what's behind it, what's the perception, and then again presenting data back and showcasing what's happening. In some instances with hiring managers like that, fortunately or fortunately, we have had to go through the recruitment process to actually prove what is out there so that they can speak to candidates and actually see things for themselves, which, it's had to happen for them to be able to understand the market. What about yourselves, Carla and Lisa? Any sort of final thoughts on that before we close off?
For me, I think you really... Here the key is linking with your other stakeholders, the rest of your people team. 9 times out of 10, I find that if you've got a location that are screaming and shouting about how rubbish recruitment is or how much of a struggle everything is, they're usually the same sites or services that are struggling with their compliance, with their learning development, with their health and safety. So for us, trying to link in, you don't want it to become us and them, but I think if you can work with the rest of your people team to see where you've got genuine pockets of almost non-compliance and where they perhaps need a little bit of support, whether it's skill or will is another conversation, but trying to, it then gives you a better picture of what some of the problems are within that service or location.
Yeah, I would say I'd agree with that. It's collaborating. We collaborate quite closely with our HRBPs. We create the picture from the data that we gather. We can see where we've got issues, if we're trying to fix issues. I mean, simple things like high agency spend in areas. Why is the agency spend not coming down? Oh, it's vacancy numbers, but we haven't got any vacancies to recruit to. So suddenly, actually, that changes that narrative. It's actually because there's a problem with rota management, holiday management, sickness management, and suddenly the shift changes. So yeah, I think it's working, wider in our teams as well, so that we can bring all the parts to it. It gives you a more accurate picture rather than just working in a silo. You can really sort of unpick where challenges are. I know, Carla, you mentioned about culture in some of your services and things like that. We can keep hiring people, but if there's a fundamental problem somewhere else, is it the induction process? Do you know what I mean? People not. It helps us to really identify that by working more collaboratively, working with our business partners, working with our HR business partners, our hiring managers.
Brilliant. Well, I'm going to close off there because we're going to get into trouble.